Hey everyone, so welcome to this presentation. I'm Shifali and this project is prepared by myself and my team members Camila, Jordan and Dhruv. So today I will talk about the contaminated sites in Canada in general with an equal focus on contaminated sites in BC. So we divided this project into two parts, provincial and federal. Also we presented some case studies. So now we'll talk about contaminated sites. What are contaminated sites? Contaminated sites is an area of land that contains hazardous substances that can cause damage to human health, environment, and underground services. Contamination due to on a contaminated site is caused due to past industrial and commercial activities. So certain facts about contaminated sites in BC. BC sites, in September 2012, there were 9,500 contaminated sites in BC that were registered, and out of which 71% were small, 28% were medium, and 1% were large. The typical cost of a contaminated site is about $75,000, and there are 600 sites that enter the remediation program every year. And on the right here we have a figure that shows that manufacturing industries cause 53% of contaminated sites, gasoline stations cause 20%, and abandoned mines cause 24%. And in BC itself, the contaminated sites contains mostly of heavy metals and organic chemicals. So now we'll talk about the legal regime. The Ministry of Environment administers all the controls that are legal to regulate contaminated sites. So now the legislations and regulations for contaminated sites in BC are as follows. In December 1996, the contaminated site regulations was approved. In July 2004, the Part 4 and Part 5 of the Environmental Management Act was introduced. In July 2004, the contaminated site regulations were amended, and in 2011 March, the Protocol 12 was approved for the contaminated sites. Now, let me introduce you to a very important concept in the contaminated sites. It's called brownfields, and brownfields are the contaminated industrial and commercial sites that have a potential for redevelopment. BC introduced brownfield renewal strategy in 2008, which encouraged the brownfield redevelopment across BC, and it intended to reduce risk and uncertainty in brownfield development. Now let's talk about the contaminated site remediation process, which consists of 5 stages. So I will talk about the 5 steps of the management process in detail, with screening being the preliminary step in management of contaminated sites in BC that helps to determine if a site is contaminated or not. It involves the creation of a site profile, where site profiles are forms that summarize the information about potentially contaminated sites. This form is completed by a site owner or qualified consultant acting on the site owner. The figure on the right shows the site profile form provided in Schedule 1 of the Contaminated Site Regulation. The second step is the site investigation step in this process. In this step, information is gathered to determine how contaminated a site is. Site investigations are done based on the following 2 stages, with number 1 being the preliminary site investigation stage, in which existing records are searched, people involved are interviewed, and a general location is determined. The second stage is the detailed site investigation stage, which shows the extent and impact of contamination. Now, after the site investigation is done, the findings are then compared with environmental quality standards. Now, the third step is comparing results with standards. There are two types of standards that EMA defines in order to determine the contamination of the site in reference. Number one is the numerical standard. In this standard, contaminated site regulation for soil is mentioned in Schedule 4, 5, and 10. For water, it's mentioned in Schedule 6 and 10. For sediment, it's mentioned in number 9 schedule. And for vapor, in Schedule 11. Now, number 2 is the risk-based standard, which states the acceptable risk levels from exposure of contaminants to substances at the site. Now, the fourth step is the remediation of a site. Remediating a site is removing or treating contaminant at a site. The contaminated site must meet environmental quality standards set for its intended use. The person responsible for remediation is in charge of covering site remediation process costs. Now, there are 3 ways of initiating the site remediation process. Number 1 is that a person can request ministry approval in principle of a remediation plan or voluntary remediation agreement. The next way is that the remediation order is issued by a director in case a person disagrees with the remediation process. And the last one is that the Ministry of Environment orders remediation for high-risk sites. Now, the fifth and the last step is the monitoring site. After the remediation process is done, the Ministry of Environment requires monitoring reports for the site in reference. Monitoring reports are required to be submitted to satisfy legal conditions such as approvals in principle, certificates of compliance, and orders. Now, let's talk about the contaminated site risk classification. Contaminated sites are classified based on the current condition of land, water, vapor, or sediment. But if there exists an active application for an ongoing change in use, then the classification is based on that situation. The amount of information required to determine risk classification of a site varies from site to site. It depends on 3 factors: nature and extent of contamination, site geology and hydrogeology, site proximity to receptors. And this information required to classify a site can be obtained at any stage of the 5-stage process of managing a contaminated site that I talked about in the previous slides. Now, the site risks are classified as either one of high-risk sites and non-high-risk sites. Now, before I talk about high-risk sites, let me talk briefly about non-aqueous phase liquid, which goes by the acronym NAPLs. Non-aqueous phase liquid is a kind of liquid solution contaminant that doesn't dissolve in water, and so if it is spilled, it tends to sink right into the ground and contaminates the deepest groundwater source, as we can see in the figure on the right. Now, moving on to the high-risk sites. A site is high risk if mobile non-aqueous phase liquids are present at that site, or that site is being exposed to high concentration of contaminants. Also, Protocol 12 talks about the conditions for a site to be high risk, with condition 1 being the presence of a mobile non-aqueous phase liquid, since it will not only lead to the spread of contaminants at that site, but also increase the cost and effort required during the remediation process. Condition number 2 states that potential high-risk exposure exists to a site if upper cap concentrations are exceeded and complete exposure pathways are present. And now, obviously, as the name suggests, non-high-risk sites are the ones that do not follow conditions 1 and 2 of the Protocol 12. Now, let's have a look at the site classification distribution. They're reviewed based on their contaminated sites are reviewed based on their classification. As we can see in the pie chart, the 7% shows the percentage of high-risk sites that are reviewed by the ministry, since the ministry does not have the capacity to provide detailed review of all the contaminated site application. Whereas 93% of contaminated sites are considered non-high risk, and so they are reviewed by approved professionals. Alright, so now that we are done with the provincial part of the contaminated sites, let's talk about the federal part. Let me introduce you to the concept of custodians. Custodians are federally appointed companies or organizations who are responsible for the handling, managing, remediating, and monitoring of contaminated sites across Canada. Some of these companies are Transport Canada, Fisheries, and Oceans Canada, and Environment, and Climate Change Canada. Excuse me. So now let's have a look at Federal Contaminated Site Action Plan. Its objective is to reduce the environmental and human health risk from known federal contaminated sites. It was established in 2005, and $4.54 billion have been already spent on this plan. Now there are 3 phases to this plan, with number 1 being Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory. The phase 2 is National Classification System for Contaminated Sites, and number 3 is Decision Making Framework. Now let's talk about phase 1. A detailed list of over 23,000 all known federal contaminated sites was included in this site inventory. Treasury Board released Federal Contaminated Sites and Solid Waste Landfills Inventory. The policy mandated that custodial departments create a database of all contaminated sites and solid waste landfills. The information that includes in this plan are location and date of contamination, nature of contaminant, severity of contamination, amount of contaminant and medium, contaminated medium, and progress to date. Now the second phase is the National Classification System for Contaminated Site, a necessary system which allows for rational evaluation of each contaminated site depending on 3 major characteristics is what is NCSCS. So the contaminant characteristics are, there are 3 contaminant characteristics, which are toxicity, residence media, and quantity of contaminants, etc. So let's talk about point system for NCSCS. Each of 3 characteristic contaminant characteristics, migration potential, and exposure is scored out of 33, 33, and 34, and which totals up to 100 points. Class 1 lists the high priority for action contaminated sites, which are scored greater than 70. Class 2 is medium priority for action, which is between 50 and 69.9. Class 3 shows the low priority for action contaminated sites between 37 and 49.9. Class N shows not priority for action, which is less than 37. And Class INS, which shows the insufficient information, which is greater than 15% of responses, which shows that we don't know much about contaminated sites. Now, this is the phase 3 for FCSCSC, decision making framework. Step 1 being identifying the suspected site, step 2 being the historical review, step 3 being initial testing program, step 4 classifying a site, which is optional. Step 5 is the detailed testing program. Step 6, the reclassifying a site. Step 7, developing remediation strategy. Step 8, implementing strategy. Step 9, confirmatory sampling and final reporting. Step 10, long-term monitoring, that is if required. Now, let's have a look at the 2005 to 2016 price of remediation. Across 793 high priority sites, $475 million were spent just in 2015 on assessment, care, maintenance, remediation, and monitoring. Of the $529 million spent in 2015 across all site classifications, the high priority site account for nearly 90% of total budget. Now, we're done with the federal part of the contaminated sites. Let's talk about some of the challenges and concerns we came across. For provincial, there was lack of available quantifiable data regarding site assessment or review and remediation costs. There was no record of the number of sites that are being reviewed, assessed, or remediated at any point of time. And for federal, we saw that the goals set for previous phase 1 and 2 have been a little too ambitious, and the sites can get hung up in the assessment phase. In conclusion, we can say that the Ministry of Environment should work more closely with CSAP in the development of other means to further expedite the review timelines. The CSAP could potentially support the Ministry of Environment in dealing with the more complex contaminated sites. And funding on the BC registry site should be made available to update the database, making it more user-friendly to the needs of site remediation professionals, industry, and municipalities involved. And across all contaminated sites, petroleum hydrocarbons account for about 47% of all the contaminants. Now, in recommendation, we thought that the regulations for storage of PHC should be increased, and certain sites with PHC contamination to bypass certain steps in the process in order to fast track the remediation of these sites should be allowed. Thank you very much for paying attention to this presentation. If you like it, please share and just hit a thumbs up. Let's see. Thank you. Bye.